Inflation has been on the rise this last year. While that is frustrating for most of us, it has been devastating for those living in poverty. This episode, we talk about what causes inflation, its impact on those in poverty, and what we are going to do about it. This is the Breakthrough Podcast. Welcome to the Breakthrough Podcast. I am Corey Burris with the Georgia Center for Opportunity, and I have Kelsey with me at the Georgia Center for Opportunity. Kelsey, this is our first episode, so this is our first kind of introduction to what we're trying to do here. Why don't you share what your hope is for this podcast, but also for kind of how that connects with the work that we do at GCO?
I think it's a great opportunity. You know, it's in the name, breakthrough, right? Breaking through the noise, breaking down barriers, breaking down concepts, really making a lot of these topics that are top of mind for people across the country more accessible and a bit more relatable. I think a lot of times we get lost in some of the statistics and the data, and that's all really helpful. And we'll talk about a lot of that in these podcasts. But at the same time, it's really important to keep top of mind that we are dealing with individual human beings. And that's really what we're doing, is marrying the qualitative data with the quantitative data and saying, this is a big problem and it's affecting these individuals. And, you know, whether that's taxes, whether that's inflation, whether that's reform, I think it's really good to really run the gamut of that and help people understand the issues that are important to the everyday American.
Yeah, I think the concept that every number that is represented in data represents a person is a transformative mindset that we can have about looking at this stuff from a big picture, right? Like today we're going to talk about inflation being this big kind of number that we hear on a monthly basis. You know, what's our inflation number about now? And it's easy to kind of either hear a big number or look at a number that doesn't have any definition to it and go, well, that sucks, or that's good, and not be able to interpret what does that actually mean for people, specifically people that live in the margins and are living, you know, day to day, have issues that are surrounded by poverty and other things like that. How does it actually impact those in those communities? So super light topic to talk about on our first episode.
Inflation.
But there we go. Inflation, right?
So it's the most fascinating one to start with, but it actually is. It's interesting once you dig into it, but the number itself sounds a little academic. So again, like that's why I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to actually look at this and say, what does this mean to people, like real people on a day-to-day basis? Absolutely.
So let's talk. So when we say inflation, we're talking about the idea that what you are able to purchase with your dollars is less than what it was before, which you and I were talking about this before. And that's why the name inflation is probably not it's kind of just
it's confusing, in some ways, right? Yeah. It's confusing to people because people hear inflation and they think more. And the problem is that the issue is actually that you can buy less with the same amount of money. So it's a confusing concept when by name alone.
I've heard us use internally the term purchasing power. And so what it is that the purchasing power of someone is diminished by having higher inflation, right? So we have the less ability to buy the goods that we need, the services that we need. The problem is that the inflation number is kind of calculated by all goods and services. And that's not really an accurate representation of the way that both you and I purchase things, but also specifically those in poverty. So like yachts could be, you know, cheaper now than they were, you know, 30 years ago. And
fantastic.
Yet all the goods, but that doesn't impact most
I'll
of
let
us,
Jeff
right?
Bezos know.
Exactly. Yeah. He's real concerned about inflation and yacht prices right now. But on the same boat, on a lesser amount is like technology, right? Like technology over time, except for Apple iPhones, get cheaper over time, right? Like, so like technology, televisions have come down in price exponentially over time, and the technology has gotten better. so it makes the inflation number look like, oh, that's not so bad. I mean, like, but things like basic goods and services have skyrocketed over the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
And that adversely impacts those that specifically aren't making big purchases, but are making small purchases on a daily basis, which is kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and there's the quote, there are lies, there are damn lies, and there are statistics. And oftentimes the inflation number falls into that third category, which is you can slice and dice the numbers however you want to tell the story that you want to tell. But the reality is that for most people, TV is not on your weekly grocery list, right? iPhone is
Right.
not on your weekly grocery list. And so even though those things have not gone up in price, or maybe they've gone down in price marginally because of the speed of technology and the economies of scale, and because labor is cheap overseas, eggs, milk, bread, gas, day-to-day things that people really need in order to survive or live comfortably have increased
Yeah.
drastically. And so really those numbers, even though they look good holistically, when you're boiling it down to what matters to individuals on a regular basis, it's pretty intense. It's been a rough couple of years, especially since 2020, looking at the price of just what we would call commodity goods.
And included in that is so you have food that's gone up,
Yeah.
somewhere close to 12%, something like that, at the lowest level, right? And
Yeah.
again, that includes all food, not just
Yes.
but when you start breaking it down by like what you're talking about, like eggs, milk,
Mm-hmm.
bread, things that we all need every day, it's even higher.
Oh
Those
yeah.
those items
Almost
have been.
double.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
rent has gone up for a lot of individuals. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so what the problem with this is that for somebody like yourself and myself, it's really annoying, right? It impacts the choices that we make. It changes um, maybe what we're purchasing at the grocery store. I'm going to choose to get this as opposed to getting this item over here. I'm going to go with an off-name brand. But for somebody
Right.
that lives in the margins, somebody that lives in poverty, it oftentimes, first of all, it impacts the choices that they're making at the grocery store of healthier foods versus non-healthy foods, which
Mm-hmm.
impacts them long-term
Mm-hmm.
health, and raises the cost of their medical bills down the road. It
Mm-hmm.
it can, rent prices skyrocketing means that they can't move into maybe a better community where there's more job opportunities, so it limits
Yep.
their access and what we call economic mobility. They can't
Mm-hmm.
move to where the jobs are, so they're kind of stuck in that environment. Uh, Things like energy costs mean that they're less likely to drive to a job that may be further away, and so
Right.
these are things that are hurting individuals that live in poverty disproportionately to how it impacts everybody else.
Yeah. I mean, and the reality, Corey, is that it's impacting everyone a lot. So it is drastically impacting these groups. I mean, there are people that are upper middle class that are struggling at this moment. So you can only imagine if before inflation was such a prevalent issue. And inflation fluctuates every year. There's always inflation.
Of
That's
course.
just the trajectory of an economy. But when it's disproportionately high, or it's been inflated by certain policy decisions or events, it takes people who were living paycheck to paycheck anyway and having to make that decision between, do I get this, this at the grocery store, do I spend this much at the grocery store, or do I pay my water bill,
Yeah.
or do I put gas in the car? Those decisions were already being made prior to things getting tight, and now it's even more prominent. So those decisions get more and more difficult as prices of everything rise, like you said, rent, utilities, transportation, gas, commodities like food and things of that sort. All of these things are increasing, and these individuals are really stuck in a difficult position. And that not only has an economic impact, it has a psychological impact. There's very
Yeah.
much a sense of defeat or discouragement when people don't feel like the problem is within their control. because they can't control inflation. That's a
Yeah.
macroeconomic thing. And so they're put in this position where they're like, okay, well, what can I do to get out of this situation? And that's really what we try to focus on as an organization are, what are the things that we can do on a community, on a state, on a federal level to try to move those levers so that people can start to see a way out of it. And it's a long haul, but step by step, and every little bit counts.
And part of what we do organizationally is uh, help inform those unintended consequences. I think that a lot of, I mean, this gets into a little bit of like, why has inflation been so bad over the last
Mm-hmm.
few years? Obviously, things like the pandemic and lockdowns and influx in cash, where we were sending money checks to people on a
Mm-hmm.
regular basis, had impacts in terms of inflation. That was not the intention of those actions, right? It was other things, but we're paying the price for it,
Mm-hmm.
both literally and metaphorically, right now, right? But
You know what they say
um,
about the road to hell.
yeah,
It's always
exactly, right,
paved with
like
good intentions, right? It's
exactly,
sometimes we're making short-term decisions based on fear or lack of information, and it sometimes people are not taking a step back to think what are the long-term consequences of, you mentioned lockdowns, right? If we're looking at the cause of inflation, it boils down to supply and demand, always in a free market economy.
right, right,
Obviously if you're in a socialist or a different type of economic situation, it's different. But in a free market economy, supply and demand will dictate whether or not there's inflation, deflation, et cetera. And when you have an entire country who is not going to work because they're not permitted to, and a
right,
lot of those jobs that were, that companies got rid of for at least a short period of time, were manufacturing, were shipping, were logistics, were the types of jobs where people were not only producing these materials that we need, but transporting them and stocking them, and that wasn't happening. And so there's this, even if demand had not increased, the supply was so low that it
right,
caused this economic situation that we're in, this inflationary thing. And there are a lot of things that press on inflation, and we don't have to get into the detailed mechanics of it.
right.
But that, from a very high level, is kind of what we're looking at: is people weren't working, things weren't being produced, things weren't being shipped. People still need toilet paper. I mean, I will be fine if we never have to experience toilet paper Mageddon ever
Right.
again, or with
It
anything.
was stressful. I'm going to be really honest with you. It was very stressful at that
I
time. It
mean, you're
was.
talking about like really seeing human behavior in a crisis situation.
Yeah.
Like I remember, this is completely off topic, but when we were kids, there would be a toy that was like the toy, the Tickle Me
Yep.
Elmo, it,
Yep.
it happens still on Black Fridays where you've got people just fist
Rushing to
fighting
the
in
store. Yeah.
Walmart, yeah, for this scarce item. And that's a microcosm. The Black Friday effect is a microcosm. But when you have an entire population that is scared they're not going to be able to get basic resources, this is what happens.
Right. And so this is not us trying to say lockdowns were evil, or this is not what we're talking about. We're talking
No.
about the again unintended
Yes.
consequences of the
Yeah.
choices that came out of that,
Yeah.
which was we thought we were doing one thing, and what we were doing is actually causing another, and it's a snowballing effect that's
Mm-hmm.
happened, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you and I were talking about this also, that sometimes some businesses have gone back to the way it was before, but a lot of them changed the way that they do business in many
Mm-hmm.
ways. Maybe reducing staff because they noticed, oh man, when we stopped, having this person do this or
Yeah.
that, we reduced costs.
Yeah.
And what that did is it changed the market in an
Mm-hmm.
unexpected way.
Mm-hmm.
And who were the people that were being hired to stock those? Were people that were poorer or living in needed those jobs
Mm-hmm.
in a different way. And so
Yeah.
what we're seeing is this like cycle of the choices that we make at a federal level, at a state level, and at a local level have direct impact on things like inflation and on the daily lives of people. And it's important that organizations like ours, but also the policymakers that are out there, be informed as to what could be the possible side effects for the policy that they are trying to enact. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is raise awareness of, like, you think what you're doing is good, but you're not actually thinking about the implications of this to somebody living, in poverty.
Well, and you're talking about decisions that are very hard to make too, because
Yeah.
again, to your point, I think for the most part, people were doing the best they thought they could with the information that they had. And a lot of times in those situations, it's weighing which is the less of the two evils.
Yeah.
And so that's where that forward thinking, that's where that 3 years from now, how will this impact people, has to come in. So you look at, and we don't have to get into the details of it, but the way that Florida handled that was very different from the way that California handled it. And if you look at those two states right now, they're very different places. They're completely different worlds.
Yeah.
And so that is a small level insight into how different decisions at a state level can impact an entire population of people. But at the same time, I think a lot of policy decisions, especially around finances, which impact inflation, are done within a vacuum, a data and statistics vacuum.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the numbers make sense, all else held equal. But all else held equal doesn't exist in the real world, because humans are humans, and there is psychology and sociology that has to be factored into these decisions, because human behavior changes based on the perception of risk and, scarcity and opportunity. And those things are equally important, because economics isn't just dollars and cents. Economics is when human beings interact with a fiscal policy. That's socioeconomics, that's behavioral economics, and that's the world we actually live in. It's not in a classroom, and it's not around a table, it's in the real world.
Again, the numbers, whether they're dollar numbers, data numbers, all represent people and actions, right?
Yes.
And that's important for us to remember. And I think that's a theme that you will continue to hear from us in episodes going forward. We're gonna dive into things like benefits cliffs, which are a very complex and deep understanding, public safety, how that impacts the choices that we make day to day, and whether the choices that are made, again, at a city level or at a state level, how that impacts people's lives. But it's something that I think we need to keep an eye on, and keep the focus on how these macro decisions are impacting people at a micro level, at a community level. And it's going to be interesting.
And the sort of the hidden threads between these things. So because of the work that we do, we understand the connectedness of these different topics, but the average person who doesn't work in policy world, right, might not connect the dot between how inflation affects crime rates, right? And so it's important to connect those dots, because again, we're talking about inflation affecting human behavior affecting people in poverty disproportionately as far as the way that they're interacting with a bad economy. Those people living in marginalized communities, and those communities experiencing higher levels of violence, lower quality of education. So all these things they're interconnected, and that's really what we're going to explore and dive deeper into in future episodes. And I'm excited to do that, because I think it's important to understand how everything relates to one another.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity to give both voice and a little bit of background into how all of these things happen to people that are living in poverty, that oftentimes are not on podcasts like this or talking about how it's impacting. They're just trying to survive, right? Like they're just trying to make it to the next day, and there's nobody out there representing their needs and their wants. And that's what we're really here to do.
Great conversation, Corey. I'm so excited to explore these topics in future podcasts. And we've touched on a lot of different themes lightly today that we'll dig into in a little bit more detail in future episodes. We really hope you'll join us for those, whether it's talking about welfare system, talking about public safety, or anything in between. But at the end of the day, we're looking forward to breaking through the noise, breaking down the barriers, breaking down the issues, and really bringing people together to find solutions to these issues that affect everyday Americans. So we look forward to seeing you on future podcasts.